Some buildings do not collapse because they are empty. They remain standing because something inside them refuses to be forgotten. The snow began just after midnight, drifting sideways through the hills around Ash Hollow like pale smoke carried by the wind. Elias Mercer drove slowly along the frozen county road, both hands gripping the cracked steering wheel of his aging Ford pickup while the heater rattled uselessly beneath the dashboard. The storm had swallowed the mountains hours ago, turning the world beyond the headlights into a blur of white and shadow. Beside him, Ranger sat upright in the passenger seat, ears alert, amber eyes fixed on the darkness ahead as if he could hear something moving beneath the storm itself. The German shepherd's silver-gray coat shimmered faintly whenever the dashboard lights flickered, and every few seconds his nose twitched toward the frozen windshield. Elias noticed it immediately. Ranger only acted that way when something felt wrong or important. The road curved sharply past a collapsed gas station and an old church whose steeple leaned like a tired man against the wind. Ash Hollow looked like the kind of town people forgot on purpose. Most of the storefronts stood dark behind layers of ice, their windows boarded shut, their signs faded into ghosts of old lettering. Snow gathered along the sidewalks in deep, uneven drifts, untouched except for the occasional set of animal tracks disappearing into alleyways. Elias had passed through hundreds of towns since leaving the army 6 years earlier, but something about this one felt unusually still, not peaceful. Listening, Ranger suddenly lifted his head higher. A low sound rolled from his throat, not quite a growl, more like recognition. Elias glanced toward him. "You hear something, boy?" Ranger's ears twitched sharply toward the eastern edge of town, where a large shape emerged slowly through the snowfall. At first it looked like another abandoned warehouse buried beneath decades of winter. But as the truck moved closer, Elias saw tall windows, cracked stone steps, and a rusted flagpole leaning over a courtyard swallowed by weeds and snow. St. Mercy School. The old sign above. The entrance barely clung to the brick wall, one side hanging loose as the wind pushed against it with a hollow metallic creak. Lightning flashed somewhere beyond the mountains, briefly illuminating the entire structure in pale silver. 4 stories tall, narrow windows black as empty eyes. A place built long before modern towns learned how to feel warm. Elias slowed the truck. Ranger stood immediately, placing both front paws against the dashboard. His breathing changed. Focused. Intent. Snow hammered against the windshield harder now, and the road ahead disappeared completely beneath blowing ice. They would not make it much farther tonight. Elias exhaled slowly and killed the engine beside the school steps. Silence rushed into the cab so suddenly it almost rang in his ears. For a moment neither man nor dog moved. Then Ranger tilted his head toward the building. Tap, tap, tap. 3 deliberate knocks of his paw against the truck door. Elias stared at him quietly. He had learned that signal years ago overseas. Ranger used it whenever he sensed hidden movement underground. "You've got that look again," Elias murmured softly. The dog never looked away from the school. Wind pushed snow across the courtyard in slow spirals as Elias stepped out into the freezing night, boots crunching over ice. The cold bit instantly through his flannel coat and denim gloves, carrying with it the scent of pine, rust, and something older buried beneath the storm. Ranger jumped down beside him, landing lightly despite his size. The school towered above them in silence. One of the second-floor windows moved slightly, not enough to open, just enough to tremble. Elias frowned and looked up toward the dark glass. There was no electricity running to the building. The entire town looked half dead. Yet somewhere deep inside St. Mercy School, something had just moved. Ranger pressed close to Elias's leg, staring toward the entrance doors as another low vibration traveled faintly through the frozen ground beneath their feet, almost like a heartbeat buried somewhere far below the snow. The front doors resisted at first as if the cold itself had fused them shut sometime decades earlier. Elias leaned his shoulder against the cracked wood while wind hissed through the empty courtyard behind him. And after a long groan of rusted hinges, the doors finally gave way inward. A breath of stale air rolled out from the darkness, carrying the scent of dust, mildew, wet stone, and something faintly metallic beneath it all. Ranger stepped inside first without hesitation, nails clicking softly across black and white tiles dulled by years of grime. The beam from Elias's flashlight drifted slowly through the entrance hall, revealing faded bulletin boards, overturned trophy cases, and rows of lockers whose paint had peeled away in curling strips like dead bark. Snowflakes swirled through broken windows high above the staircase, vanishing into the silence before they touched the floor. Elias shut the doors behind them, and immediately the storm outside became distant, muted, almost unreal. Inside the school, every sound seemed trapped beneath layers of time. Ranger moved carefully down the hallway, head low, ears forward, listening. Elias followed more slowly, boots echoing through the corridor with a hollow rhythm that made the building feel larger than it should have been. His flashlight passed over old classroom doors still bearing faded painted numbers. Room 104. Room 108. Music hall. Some stood slightly open, while others remained chained shut with rusted locks. On one wall, beneath years of water damage, a mural of smiling children still stretched across the plaster in pale faded colors. Their painted faces looked strangely untouched by time. Elias stopped near the main office where an American flag hung folded beneath thick cobwebs beside a dusty portrait of President Eisenhower. The date beneath the portrait caught his attention immediately. 1958. He frowned slightly. The school looked older than that. Much older. Ranger suddenly froze halfway down the hallway. His body stiffened. Then came the sound. Tap, tap, tap. 3 sharp knocks echoed somewhere deep beneath the floorboards. Elias lifted the flashlight immediately. Silence followed. Not even wind. Ranger stared toward the eastern wing of the building without blinking. You heard it too, Elias whispered. The dog gave no reaction except a slow step forward. The eastern hallway narrowed as they moved deeper into the school. Ceiling tiles sagged overhead, and old school papers lay scattered across the floor like leaves trapped indoors by winter. Elias noticed strange marks along the walls now. Small scratches beside door frames. Numbers faded into the paint. Arrows pointing downward. The farther they walked, the colder the air became. Not natural cold. Heavy cold. The kind that settled into old stone places untouched by sunlight. Ranger stopped outside a set of double doors labeled auditorium. One door hung partly open. The other remained chained shut from the outside. Elias swept the flashlight across the chain. Military-grade steel. His jaw tightened slightly. That did not belong in a public school. Ranger let out a soft whine and pressed his nose against the gap between the doors. Somewhere beyond them came a low vibration, barely noticeable, a faint hum rising and falling at steady intervals beneath the silence. Elias felt the hairs rise along the back of his neck. He had heard vibrations like that before years ago overseas while inspecting underground bunkers after air raids. Concrete carried sound differently underground. It breathed. He pushed the loose auditorium door wider open, and the flashlight revealed hundreds of empty seats covered in dust facing a stage draped by rotting velvet curtains. Above the stage hung a single light fixture swaying gently back and forth though no wind moved inside the room. Elias stood completely still watching it. Ranger's breathing deepened beside him. Then from somewhere underneath the stage came the unmistakable sound of metal scraping slowly against metal. Not loud. Careful. Almost as if something below them had just awakened after a very long sleep. The scraping sound stopped the moment Elias stepped closer to the stage, leaving behind a silence so complete it almost felt deliberate. Ranger remained rigid beside the first row of seats, eyes fixed on the darkness beneath the warped wooden platform. The dog's ears twitched constantly, as if tracking movements too faint for human hearing. Elias swept the flashlight slowly across the stage curtains. Dust floated through the beam like pale ash drifting underwater. Somewhere above them, pipes groaned softly inside the walls as winter pressed harder against the old building. Then came the vibration again. Low, rhythmic, almost alive. Elias crouched near the edge of the stage and placed one gloved hand against the floorboards. Cold traveled through the wood immediately, followed by a faint pulse every few seconds. Not random settling. A pattern. Ranger stepped forward beside him and pressed one paw against the stage. Tap, tap, tap. 3 measured knocks. Elias exhaled slowly. All right, he murmured. Show me. Ranger moved toward the left side of the stage where old velvet curtains pooled across the dusty floor. Behind them stood a narrow stairwell leading backstage into darkness thick with the smell of damp wood and rust. Elias followed carefully, flashlight moving across broken props, fallen music stands, and shelves cluttered with forgotten costumes sealed beneath decades of dust. The backstage hallway felt colder than the rest of the school. The air carried a strange metallic scent now, mixed with something faintly electrical. Ranger stopped beside a large oak cabinet tipped sideways against the wall. Its drawers had spilled open long ago, scattering yellowed papers across the floor. The dog lowered his nose near the baseboard and released a low rumble deep in his chest. Elias pushed the cabinet gently aside. Hidden behind it, almost invisible beneath peeling paint, was a narrow steel door no more than 4 feet tall. His flashlight revealed faded black lettering stamped into the metal. Shelter B. The words sent an old tension crawling up Elias's spine. He had seen similar markings years ago inside military tunnels overseas. Temporary shelters, underground bunkers, emergency evacuation routes. But none of that explained why a small-town school in northern Montana had one hidden behind a stage wall. Ranger sniffed near the bottom corner of the door, then suddenly jerked his head upward toward the ceiling. Elias listened carefully. At first he heard nothing except distant wind pushing against broken windows. Then, slowly another sound emerged beneath it. Static. Faint radio static crackling somewhere below the floor. His brow tightened. There was no power running to the building. No generators. No electricity at all. Yet the sound continued softly beneath the silence like an old signal trapped underground waiting for someone to hear it again. Elias reached for the rusted handle. Locked. The steel barely moved beneath his grip. Thick layers of corrosion covered the hinges, but the scratches around the lock looked newer than the rest of the door. Not recent, but newer. Someone had tried opening it years after the school closed. Ranger suddenly backed away from the wall, tail low, ears standing rigid. Then the dog looked directly toward the far end of the backstage hallway where darkness swallowed the corridor completely. Elias followed his gaze and felt his chest tighten slightly. A faint glow flickered there for only a second. Warm yellow light, like an old lantern moving behind a distant doorway. Then it vanished. Silence returned immediately afterward, heavy and watchful. Elias stood motionless, flashlight steady in his hand, while snow hissed softly against the windows somewhere above them. Ranger moved closer again, pressing against Elias's leg as though urging him not to ignore what they had both seen. On the floor near the steel door, partly hidden beneath dust and collapsed plaster, Elias noticed something else. A child's drawing. He knelt slowly and lifted the paper carefully into the flashlight beam. Crayon outlines of mountains, pine trees, a schoolhouse beneath falling snow. And beneath it, written in shaky pencil letters, were 4 simple words. The basement keeps breathing tonight. The drawing trembled slightly in Elias's hand as another low vibration moved through the walls around them. Not strong enough to shake the building, only enough to make the hanging pipes above the backstage corridor release a faint metallic hum. Ranger stared at the paper for several long seconds before turning slowly toward the darkness beyond the steel door again. The dog's amber eyes reflected the flashlight beam like small flames against the black hallway. Elias folded the drawing carefully and slipped it into the inside pocket of his flannel jacket. Something about the childish handwriting unsettled him more than the sounds beneath the school. It did not feel imaginary. It felt like a warning left behind by someone who had heard the same thing many years earlier. The storm outside deepened as midnight crept closer. Snow tapped softly against the upper windows while wine drifted through cracks in the old walls with the sound of distant whispering. Elias returned to the main hallway carrying an old folding chair he found inside the janitor's closet near the gymnasium. He built a small lantern from the emergency supplies in his truck and placed it near the auditorium entrance, its warm yellow glow barely touching the surrounding darkness. Ranger paced constantly now, never resting longer than a few seconds at a time. Every few minutes he stopped and listened toward the eastern wing as though tracking something slowly moving beneath the building itself. Elias sat heavily against the wall beside the lantern, exhaustion settling into his shoulders like wet snow. The long roads, the endless drifting from town to town, the years spent sleeping inside trucks, motels, shelters, and empty parking lots had worn quiet grooves into him that never fully disappeared. Sometimes he wondered if men like him ever truly came home after war, or if they simply learned how to carry the silence differently. Ranger walked over and lowered himself beside him with a tired breath. Elias rested one hand gently against the dog's neck. "You always know before I do," he said quietly. Ranger closed his eyes for a moment, but did not relax completely. His ears still twitched toward distant sounds buried somewhere beneath the floor. The lantern flickered softly between them, casting long shadows across the cracked hallway tiles. Then, without warning, a sound drifted faintly through the school. Music. Elias straightened immediately. Very soft, thin and distant like a memory traveling through old walls. A piano. Ranger stood at once. The melody lasted only a few seconds before fading back into silence, but Elias recognized it instantly. Moonlight Sonata. His mother used to play it when he was a child before sickness took the strength from her hands. He stared toward the darkness ahead, unsettled by how clearly he had heard it. There were no working instruments inside the building. No electricity. Nothing except dust and winter. Yet somewhere in the school, a piano key had just been touched. Ranger moved down the hallway slowly, stopping near a faded sign hanging crookedly above an open doorway. Music room. The dog looked back once as if asking Elias to follow. Inside, moonlight spilled faintly through tall windows coated with frost. Desks sat abandoned beneath sheets of dust, and old brass instruments lined the walls inside cracked glass cabinets. At the center of the room stood an upright piano draped in a gray cloth. Ranger approached it cautiously. The cloth shifted slightly, though no wind entered the room. Elias stepped closer and slowly pulled the cover away. Dust swirled upward through the flashlight beam. The piano beneath remained surprisingly untouched. Clean keys. Polished wood. Almost preserved. Elias frowned deeply. Every other room inside the school had decayed under years of neglect, but this piano looked maintained somehow. Ranger sniffed near the pedals, then suddenly pawed once at the floorboards beneath it. A hollow sound echoed upward immediately. Elias knelt beside the piano and ran his hand slowly across the wooden floor. Different grain, different nails, a hidden section. His heartbeat slowed as realization settled over him. Whatever lay beneath St. Mercy School was not buried by accident. Someone had hidden it carefully and then built the entire music room on top of it afterward. Before Elias could speak, the piano released a single note by itself. Soft, clear, beautiful. And somewhere far below the school, something answered with 3 slow knocks rising through the darkness beneath their feet. The piano note lingered in the air long after the sound itself disappeared, trembling softly through the music room like the fading echo of a memory too old to die completely. Elias remained kneeling beside the hidden floor section, his flashlight resting across the dusty boards while Ranger stared downward. With complete focus. Outside, snow continued falling against the frozen windows in slow silver waves, sealing the school deeper inside the storm. Another low vibration rolled beneath them, this time stronger. The floor trembled faintly beneath Elias's hand. Ranger stepped backward immediately, ears high, muscles tense beneath his thick coat. Elias pressed harder against the wood and heard it clearly now. Hollow space underneath. Large hollow space. He stood slowly and moved the piano bench aside before gripping the edge of the floorboards near the wall. Years of military engineering had taught him how buildings hid their secrets. Different nails, different wood grain. Slight elevation changes invisible to most eyes. Someone had built this section to remain unnoticed. He wedged the blade of his utility knife into the seam and pulled upward carefully. The boards resisted at first with a deep groan before finally lifting several inches. Dust burst upward into the flashlight beam. Beneath the floor sat a narrow iron ring attached to a square steel hatch hidden perfectly beneath the piano. Ranger released a soft whine the moment the hatch became visible. Elias wiped years of grime away from the metal surface. More military markings. Faded numbers. Emergency shelter codes almost identical to those he had seen overseas. But one detail unsettled him more than the others. The hatch showed almost no rust. Impossible after decades underground. It looked maintained somehow. Elias wrapped both hands around the iron ring and pulled. At first nothing happened. Then slowly, with the sound of ancient metal dragging against concrete, the hatch shifted open several inches. A breath of cold air rushed upward immediately, carrying the smell of stone, old paper, machine oil, and something strangely clean beneath it all. Not decay. Preservation. Ranger stepped closer to the opening and stared downward into darkness, so complete it swallowed the flashlight beam after only a few feet. Then came the sound again. Static. Soft radio static drifting upward from below the school. Elias swallowed quietly. "There is no way this place still has power," he whispered. Ranger answered with 3 low barks that echoed unnaturally through the room before fading into silence below. Elias aimed the flashlight down through the opening. Steel ladder. Concrete shaft. Deep enough that the bottom remained invisible. The walls looked dry despite the years. Carefully engineered. Carefully sealed. He hesitated for the first time since entering the school. Not because he feared danger. War had burned most ordinary fear out of him long ago. But because something about the place below felt untouched by time itself. Like opening a room that history had somehow forgotten to reclaim. Ranger suddenly looked toward the classroom door behind them. His body stiffened again. Elias turned immediately. At the far end of the dark hallway outside the music room stood a faint figure illuminated by moonlight spilling through broken windows. Small. Motionless. A child no older than 10, wearing what looked like an old winter coat. Elias narrowed his eyes, trying to focus through the darkness. The figure lifted one arm slowly and pointed toward the open hatch beneath the piano. Then lightning flashed outside the school. For a split second, the entire hallway filled with white light. When darkness returned, the figure was gone. Ranger did not bark. He simply lowered his head quietly as though the dog understood something Elias did not. Snow hissed softly against the glass while the lantern down the hallway flickered weakly in the growing cold. Somewhere beneath them, deep below the school, an old radio crackled alive for 3 brief seconds before a voice emerged through the static. Thin, distant, almost swallowed by time itself. "Shelter B remains sealed. Keep the children quiet." Then silence returned once more, heavy as snowfall over forgotten graves. The voice dissolved back into static, so quickly Elias almost questioned whether he had truly heard it at all. But Ranger's reaction erased any doubt. The German shepherd stood frozen beside the open hatch, ears rigid, eyes fixed downward into the darkness beneath the school, while a low, uneasy rumble vibrated through his chest. Snow pressed harder against the windows now, turning the music room pale blue beneath flashes of distant lightning. Elias grabbed the lantern from the hallway and lowered it carefully toward the opening. Warm light slid down the concrete shaft, revealing steel ladder rungs disappearing nearly 20 feet underground before vanishing into shadow. The walls looked strangely untouched by age. No heavy water damage. No collapsed concrete. Just smooth gray surfaces disappearing into silence. Elias clipped the lantern onto his belt and tightened the collar of his flannel jacket against the growing cold. "Stay close," he murmured softly. Ranger stepped forward immediately. Together they began descending into the hidden shaft beneath St. Mercy School. The air grew colder with every rung. Not the ordinary cold of winter storms or mountain nights. This cold felt sealed away, preserved. Elias could hear his own breathing echo faintly against the concrete walls, while Ranger's claws clicked softly against the steel ladder below him. Halfway down, the smell changed. Dust faded into something cleaner. Machine oil, old paper, dry wood, the scent of rooms protected from time. When Elias finally reached the bottom, his boots touched smooth concrete untouched by dirt or debris. He raised the lantern slowly. The underground corridor stretched ahead in both directions beneath dim emergency lights, glowing faint amber along the ceiling. Elias stopped breathing for a moment. Electricity. Somehow the underground shelter still had electricity after all these years. Weak, flickering, but alive. Ranger moved carefully beside him, every muscle tense beneath his thick fur. The corridor walls carried faded signs pointing towards storage rooms, water tanks, medical supply areas, and classrooms. Classrooms. Elias stared at the words quietly, while distant static drifted through hidden speakers somewhere deeper underground. The shelter was far larger than he imagined. Not a bunker. A hidden underground school. The emergency lights buzzed softly overhead as they moved deeper into the corridor. Metal doors lined both sides of the hallway, each marked with painted numbers and old military shelter symbols. Some doors stood slightly open while others remained sealed tight. Elias passed one small window and paused. Immediately, inside sat rows of tiny desks covered in dust. Children's books remained stacked neatly beside a chalkboard, where faded handwriting still lingered beneath years of darkness. Stay quiet during drills. The words sent a strange ache through his chest. Ranger stopped near another doorway farther down the corridor. His nose twitched rapidly before he pushed the door open with one paw. Elias stepped inside slowly. A sleeping room. Small cots lined the walls beneath neatly folded wool blankets untouched by decay. Tin cups still sat on a nearby table beside old board games and scattered crayons. Everything looked abandoned in a hurry but preserved carefully afterward, as though the people who left believed they would return soon. Elias walked slowly through the room while lantern light trembled across old photographs taped beside the beds. Smiling children. Teachers. Snow-covered mountains behind the school decades earlier. Then his eyes settled on one photograph near the far wall. A younger version of St. Mercy School stood proudly beneath an American flag during wartime. And beside the front entrance stood a man wearing a military engineer uniform almost identical to the one Elias himself had worn years ago overseas. The resemblance struck him immediately. Same broad shoulders. Same sharp jawline. Same tired eyes carrying too much silence. Ranger suddenly released a sharp bark toward the hallway outside. Elias turned instantly. The emergency lights flickered once, twice. Then every light along the corridor dimmed at the same time. A deep mechanical hum awakened somewhere below the shelter floor. Slow, rhythmic, ancient machinery returning to life beneath the mountain. Then over the old speaker system, buried beneath layers of static, a woman's calm voice echoed softly through the underground halls. Evening attendance will begin shortly. Please keep the children inside Shelter B. The woman's voice faded into static, but the underground shelter no longer felt abandoned after hearing it. The air itself seemed awake now. Emergency lights flickered softly along the corridor, while the deep mechanical hum beneath the concrete floor continued at slow, steady intervals, almost like the heartbeat of the hidden place beneath the school. Elias stood motionless for several seconds, listening to the silence that followed the announcement. Somewhere farther down the corridor, metal pipes groaned softly as warm air drifted faintly through ancient vents overhead. Ranger pressed close against Elias's leg, alert but no longer frightened. The dog's posture had changed. He looked less like an animal sensing danger and more like a soldier entering sacred ground. Elias stepped back into the hallway, lantern glow stretching long shadows across the concrete walls. Dust moved slowly through the stale air, untouched by wind, untouched by time. Along one wall hung framed photographs preserved behind cloudy glass. Children wearing winter coats smiled beside teachers holding books and thermoses. Christmas decorations hung from the shelter ceiling in several pictures, paper snowflakes and handmade stars taped carefully across underground classrooms. Elias stopped before one photograph in particular. A group of children stood gathered around an elderly woman seated beside an old radio set. Written beneath the picture in faded ink were the words, Winter Shelter Choir, December 1952. Ranger suddenly lifted his head toward the end of the corridor. Tap, tap, tap. 3 distant knocks echoed softly through the underground halls. Elias followed the sound carefully until the corridor widened into a larger chamber hidden beneath the school gymnasium above. His lantern revealed rows of long wooden tables, storage shelves stacked with canned food, old blankets folded neatly inside crates, and dozens of tiny handprints painted across one concrete wall in fading colors. Children had lived here, not briefly, long enough to build routines, lessons, games, and memories underground while the world above carried on through war and winter. Elias walked slowly between the tables. One still held scattered checker pieces frozen mid-game beside a small Bible and a cracked pair of reading glasses. Another held unfinished homework papers dated February 19, 1953. Ranger moved deeper into the chamber before stopping beside an old radio console built into the far wall. Unlike everything else in the shelter, the console still glowed faintly with amber light. Static whispered softly from its speakers. Elias crouched beside it carefully. The machine looked ancient but maintained. Wires disappeared through the concrete floor below, while a reel-to-reel tape unit spun slowly beneath layers of dust. Then suddenly the static sharpened. A man's voice emerged weak but clear through the speaker. If anyone finds this recording, Please understand we stayed because the storm never stopped. Elias froze completely. The voice continued between bursts of static. The roads collapsed. Communications failed. We could not move the children safely through the mountains. Shelter B became their home. Ranger lowered himself quietly beside the radio, ears twitching at every word. The voice sounded exhausted but calm. The school above remained open during the day, so nobody would suspect how many children were hidden below. We told them stories. We taught lessons. We kept the lights warm at night, so they would not be afraid. Elias stared at the glowing radio, while something heavy settled into his chest. The shelter had not been built for war alone. It had been built to protect children forgotten by the outside world during one terrible winter long ago. Then the recording changed. Silence crackled for several seconds before the same voice returned softer than before. If the mountain finally allows someone to hear this, please tell them we never stopped hoping somebody would come back for us. The tape clicked quietly and stopped spinning. Deep silence filled the chamber once more. Elias remained kneeling beside the radio while Ranger stared toward a dark steel door at the far end of the room, marked only with one faded word painted carefully across the surface. Archives. Then slowly, almost gently, the door began to creak open by itself. The steel archive door opened inch by inch with a long, exhausted creak that echoed softly through the underground chamber. Ranger stood immediately, ears raised, eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the doorway while the weak emergency lights flickered overhead. Elias lifted the lantern higher and stepped carefully toward the opening. Cold air drifted outward, carrying the scent of cedar boxes, old paper, and something faintly sweet beneath the dust, like forgotten candles burned long ago during winters underground. Inside, the archive room stretched farther than he expected. Tall shelves lined the concrete walls from floor to ceiling, each filled with carefully labeled boxes, binders, journals, and film reels preserved in astonishing condition. Someone had protected this place with extraordinary care. Ranger moved silently between the shelves, his claws clicking softly against the concrete, while Elias scanned the handwritten labels illuminated by lantern light. Attendance records, medical reports, winter supplies, children relocated. The deeper Elias walked into the archive room, the heavier the silence became. It did not feel empty. It felt remembered. Along the far wall stood a large wooden table beneath an old map of Ash Hollow and the surrounding mountains. Colored pins marked collapsed roads, blocked rail lines, and emergency shelter routes dating back more than 70 years. Elias studied the map quietly. A brutal winter storm must have isolated the entire region for months during the war years. Entire communities trapped beneath snow with no outside communication. Then his eyes settled on a photograph pinned beside the map. The same military engineer he had seen earlier stood beside several teachers outside the school entrance, smiling despite exhaustion visible in every face. Written beneath the photo were the words, Project Lantern, Shelter Supervisors. Elias stared at the man's face longer this time. The resemblance unsettled him deeply. Not identical, but close enough to feel personal. Ranger suddenly stopped near the back corner of the archive room, where an old phonograph rested beside a stack of sealed journals tied carefully with blue ribbon. The dog lowered himself beside the table quietly, as if he understood the importance of the place. Elias approached slowly and noticed one journal sitting apart from the others. Its leather cover carried a single name pressed faintly into the surface. Thomas Mercer. Elias felt his breath catch softly in his throat. Mercer. His own last name. He opened the journal carefully, fragile pages crackling beneath his fingers. The handwriting inside remained remarkably clear despite the decades. January 17, 1953. Supplies continue running low above ground, but the children remain safe beneath Shelter B. If weather conditions do not improve soon, we may have to remain through spring. Elias turned another page slowly. Some nights the younger ones become frightened when the mountain shifts beneath us. I tell them the sounds are only the earth remembering winter. Another page. My grandson would have been 5 years old this month. I wonder if he would have liked this place. Children deserve warm lights during storms. Elias swallowed hard as the lantern flickered gently beside him. His grandfather had once spoken very little about his own father before passing away many years earlier. Only fragments. A teacher. A wartime engineer. lost during a mountain disaster nobody fully explained. Elias looked back toward the old photograph again, and for the first time in years he felt the strange, aching pull of family history moving beneath the silence of his own life. Ranger lifted his head suddenly toward the phonograph beside the journals. Without warning, the machine crackled softly and began turning by itself. Music drifted quietly through the archive room, a slow piano melody warm enough to make the underground shelter feel human again. Elias closed his eyes for one brief moment, listening to the fragile notes echo through the hidden chamber beneath the school. Then a final page inside the journal caught his attention. Different handwriting, unsteady, written much later than the others. If anyone carrying the Mercer name ever finds this shelter, please let the children be remembered above all else. The mountain kept us hidden, but kindness kept us alive. Ranger rested his head gently against Elias's knee, while somewhere far above them, beyond layers of snow and stone, the old school bell rang once through the winter night. Morning arrived slowly over Ash Hollow, pale winter light filtering through layers of snow clouds and frozen pine branches above the silent town. The storm had finally weakened sometime before dawn, leaving the mountains wrapped in a stillness so deep it felt sacred. Elias climbed the steel ladder from Shelter B with Ranger close behind him, carrying the leather journal carefully inside his coat, while cold air drifted down from the school above. The music room looked unchanged in the early gray light, except for the faint layer of fresh snow gathered near the broken windows. Yet everything felt different now. The building no longer seemed abandoned. It felt entrusted. Ranger stepped quietly across the dusty floorboards toward the hallway, as if he already understood their work inside the school was not truly finished. Outside, Ash Hollow slowly awakened beneath the snow. Thin trails of chimney smoke curled upward into the pale sky, while pickup trucks moved carefully along frozen streets buried beneath drifts nearly 3 feet deep. Elias spent the morning inside the Old Town Diner beside the highway, speaking with the few remaining residents who still remembered St. Mercy School before it closed. Most listened in silence as he described the underground shelter hidden beneath the building. Some looked stunned. Others lowered their eyes quietly as though hearing an old ghost speak aloud for the first time in decades. Then an elderly woman near the window began to cry softly before reaching into her purse with trembling hands. She placed an old black and white photograph on the counter between them. A little girl smiling beneath paper snowflakes underground beside an old radio. "My sister," the woman whispered. "We thought those stories died with the mountain." By afternoon, several townspeople followed Elias back through the snow toward the school. The mayor came, a retired history teacher. 2 elderly brothers who remembered hearing strange radio broadcasts during the winter of 1953. Ranger led them through the silent hallways and down into Shelter B, while emergency lights still glowed softly beneath the mountain. Nobody spoke much after seeing the underground classrooms preserved exactly as they had been left more than 70 years earlier. One old man removed his hat quietly beside the rows of children's cots, while tears filled his weathered eyes. Another woman traced trembling fingers across the painted handprints on the shelter wall, as though touching the memory of someone she had once loved. Elias remained near the archive room while historians and town officials carefully examined the journals, records, photographs, and radio equipment hidden beneath the school for generations. But what moved the town most was not the mystery itself. It was the kindness preserved inside it. Teachers who stayed underground through impossible winters. Children who kept drawing stars and snowflakes despite fear and isolation. Families who never stopped hoping someone would one day remember they existed. 3 days later, the State Historical Society arrived from Helena to document the shelter officially. Reporters came soon after. So did surviving relatives of the children once hidden beneath the school during the war years. They stood quietly in the underground halls listening to old recordings restored from the radio tapes, while snow drifted softly beyond the mountains above. And through it all, Ranger remained calm beside Elias, as though the German shepherd had completed the task he was somehow always meant to find. By early spring, restoration work began across St. Mercy School. The building reopened months later as a memorial library and winter shelter museum dedicated to the families protected beneath Shelter B during the forgotten storm years. Elias stayed in Ash Hollow long after the roads cleared. At first he only helped repair walls, wiring, and heating systems inside the old school. But slowly, without fully noticing it himself, he stopped thinking about leaving. One quiet evening near the end of autumn, Elias stood outside beneath the restored school bell tower while golden light spilled warmly from the windows behind him. Children's laughter echoed faintly through the halls once more. Ranger rested beside the front steps watching snow begin to fall gently across the courtyard. The old German shepherd lifted his head toward the mountains as the school bell rang softly through the cold evening air. Not mournful anymore. Peaceful, like something unfinished had finally found its way home. Elias looked up at the falling snow and smiled faintly for the first time in many years. Because sometimes the world does not bury its miracles forever. Sometimes it simply waits for someone kind enough to listen beneath the silence.